Hi, I'm Mery, and welcome to Viewpoint. Since 2011, the Obama administration has rolled out its Countering Violent Extremism Programming, or CVE. The controversial programs, which are modeled after similar, quote, interventions in the United Kingdom, presume that there is an identifiable path to becoming a terrorist and that an intervention to prevent one from conducting criminal action is possible. Community organizations have raised concerns at CVE programming and the American Muslim communities being targeted. Joining me with his analysis is Arjun Sethi. He's the Law and Policy Director at the Sikh Coalition and an adjunct law professor at the Georgetown University. Arjun, thanks so much for being with us today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
One of the most difficult things I find in discussing CVE, or Countering Violent Extremism programs, is the presumption on the person that you're talking to say, well, what would be possibly wrong with countering violent extremism? So start a bit by just explaining to us the nature of these programs, why they were put in place, and how they've been rolled out in the United States thus far.
Sure. The purpose of these programs is to counter radicalization within the Muslim American community, specifically identifying youth who are vulnerable to becoming violent extremists. I think these programs suffer from many deficiencies. The first being that there is no single path to radicalization. Scientists who've looked at radicalization have found that radicalization is a very individual-based process. And again, there are no constant factors in determining who is at risk of becoming a violent extremist. Two, the indicators that community leaders and law enforcement are using to identify future violent extremists are, in fact, activities that are protected by the First Amendment. So, for example, we've had situations where community leaders have construed innocuous behavior like growing a beard, wearing a hijab, attending a protest, protesting U.S. foreign policy as indicators that a young Muslim American youth might one day become a violent extremist. Not only are these not indicators of future violent extremism, but all of those activities I just described are protected by the First Amendment. I think most importantly, and this gets lost in the conversation regarding CVE, is that the programs are entirely incommensurate with the threat posed, meaning Americans are 7 times more likely to die at the hands of a white violent extremist, roughly 1,000 times more likely to die because of gun violence. Yet I do not see the FBI in any form or shape looking to combat gun violence in U.S. schools or the threat posed by other kinds of violent extremism.
So I want to come back to that because I think that's a critical part of understanding why there's been so much community pushback on this programming. But part of what there seems to be a period where there was discussion of these programmings and looking at the models overseas, and then this White House summit that took place in 2014 that really aggressively rolled out the Obama administration's policies on these. What kind of shift have you seen, both in Washington and in terms of the way that these pilot programs are operating now, before and after the summit, and in practice, what has it meant for the policy discussions about the subject?
In my view, the summit was the Obama administration's decision to champion these programs. And in many ways, the summit emboldened law enforcement, it emboldened the FBI, and it emboldened particular community leaders to promulgate and further these programs. And sort of walking through sort of what CVE looks like, it began with pilot programs in 3 American cities, Los Angeles, Boston, and Minneapolis. Community leaders were asked to be the eyes and ears of law enforcement to identify early indicators of violent extremism and then report those indicators, report the individuals who were exhibiting those indicators to law enforcement. According to Lisa Monaco, President Obama's Homeland Security advisor, those indicators include traveling to conflict zones overseas, becoming confrontational at home, and ideological differences, right? I was a youth, and I used to have ideological differences with my parents, right? That by no means that I will one day become a violent extremist. So by large measure, I think these programs were a failure. And what we've heard from a lot of community leaders in those cities is that Muslim Americans lived under an umbrella of fear. Namely, that individuals were afraid of practicing their faith, were afraid of free speech, and as a consequence, I think those programs were indeed a failure. Then it sort of moved to this program called Don't Be a Puppet. And the FBI launched what I would sort of call, as you have a great graphic here, this sort of web portal where they are asking teachers and students to identify youth who are at risk of becoming violent extremists. But yet again, just like we saw with the pilot programs in Boston, Los Angeles, and Minneapolis, the indicators that this program actually uses are absurd. Those indicators include taking photos of monuments, right? So the idea that a Muslim American who wants to take a picture of a beautiful bridge, they could be identified as a future violent extremist. Or again, traveling to a conflict zone overseas. What's a conflict zone? There are many Muslim Americans who have family in Lebanon, who have family in Iraq, who have family in Saudi Arabia, which in many ways certainly is in the midst of a war against Yemen. So again, I think this program is also over-inclusive, and it also establishes the very dangerous precedent of asking teachers in schools to become an extension of law enforcement, right? It's one thing to ask a youth to identify bullying of another student. It's quite something different to ask a youth to point out a student in the classroom who could one day become a violent extremist.
So one of the things I find most interesting about this discussion with government officials about CVE programming, separate from the idea that, as you correctly pointed out, these aren't programs that have even been tested to demonstrate any effectiveness, is this idea that they repeatedly will tell you these programs do not target the American Muslim community. These are broader in their approach, that we reject the use of violence by any group, and therefore that's what we're seeking to do. The problem with that, though, has been, as you've seen in pilot programs, and even with regards to the FBI's new puppet program, it's very clear that while there is a notion that they don't want to target American Muslims, that any of the pilot programs they put in place have indeed been specific to those communities. How has that been part of this pushback, or has it been? I mean, are there administration officials actively aware that this is how these programs are being rolled out, therefore they should be concerned that these CVE the one thing I'm struck by is the amount of Secretary Johnson visits that have taken place to mosques and community centers where there are concentrations of Arab Americans and American Muslims. And the conversation is, thank you, you guys are wonderful, and please don't pay attention to ISIL as part of that narrative. I mean, really feeding into this idea that there's a community here that one needs to be cautious at a minimum and potentially suspicious of. I mean, surely that's a problem, right, if our government puts in place programs like this?
Sure. I mean, to be clear, I think CVE programs in general do not work, no matter who they target. I think they are ineffective and they show constitutionally protected activities. But as you point out, it is abundantly clear that the CVE programs the government has rolled out almost exclusively target Muslim Americans. And we know that because of meetings that, for example, I have participated in with the FBI, where they have basically conceded that they are not working with other groups, that they have not met community leaders from neo-Nazi communities, from white supremacist communities, from the animal rights activism community. And we also know, based on just the language that's coming from the administration. So if you look back at President Obama's summit, there was very little conversation about violent extremism outside the Muslim American context. And I think that is part of the pushback, right? Because it is part of the pushback because these programs, in essence, don't just chill constitutionally protected activity, don't just create an umbrella of fear, but they stigmatize Muslim Americans. They stigmatize the practice of Islam.
We have seen since the White House summit a significantly more aggressive programming in the area of CVE. You mentioned the Don't Be a Puppet program is one example of FBI looking to, because the program's targeting young people, looking to roll these out in schools. The other one I really want to spend some time talking about is this new concept of shared responsibility committees, SRCs. This is something that actually was leaked in media reports before it was shared by any government official in an Intercept story about these programs. Talk a bit about what this idea of an SRC is and how it's sort of, frankly, the logical progression in some ways of where CVE programming could end up.
Sure. So shared responsibility committees are the newest and latest CVE program. A shared responsibility committee consists of a community leader, a mental health professional, a social worker, and other leaders of influence who are tasked to intervene and help a youth who the FBI believes is at risk of becoming a violent extremist. So the FBI calls this a intervention program, right? But again, there are lots of issues with this program. First, the FBI has never clarified the criteria necessary for determining who is vulnerable to becoming a violent extremist. So for example, right, we know for a fact, because there are cases like this, where Muslim Americans have been investigated for placing large computer purchase orders at Best Buy, for buying large stacks of water from Costco, right? So the FBI refuses to clarify what activity is sufficient enough to merit intervention from an SRC. Secondly, the FBI has never specified the techniques used to ultimately identify a youth who, again, is at risk of becoming a violent extremist and thus meriting an intervention from the SRC. So, for example, we know from the DOJ racial profiling guidance that the DOJ has taken the position that mapping programs, similar to the NYPD's mapping programs of Muslim Americans, is constitutionally permissible, right? We also know that the FBI uses confidential informants to penetrate mosques, Muslim student associations, absent any connection to wrongdoing, right? So it might very well be that the SRC is actually legitimizing these practices that are over-inclusive and that stigmatize Muslim Americans. Apart from that, they're also powerless. So on a very practical level, while an SRC is helping a particular Muslim American youth, the FBI can continue to investigate them. The FBI could continue to use a confidential informant. If the SRC determines that a youth is no longer at risk of becoming a violent extremist, the FBI can still continue to investigate that youth. They can even subpoena and force the members of the SRC to testify against that particular youth. So it's unclear to me why anyone would want to join an SRC, given that they have very little protection for actually participating, and the fact that the SRC process is non-transparent and, again, is built on what I consider to be abusive law enforcement techniques.
One of the things that I thought was really challenging in the Don't Be a Puppet program, in addition, frankly, to how something targeting young people was done so poorly as a presentation, it was a website, was the disclosure on that very site where any visitor to the site should be informed that the information can be collected, that they were here, and that this can be shared with law enforcement. This for a site that the FBI had set up, presumably to provide education to someone that may be thinking about this, please come here, seek out this information, and it would provide an alternative. The issue with these SRCs that I can't get past is this idea that the intervention is to prevent someone, ideally, from taking only the criminal prosecution path. That if you've got someone and maybe they made a mistake and maybe there's sort of mental health capacity issues, or that we can provide an alternative to criminalizing their behavior and putting them in jail. But how does that play out given what you just said, which is that even this process, the SRC process, where the intervention is supposed to help someone not end up there, that the FBI can continue to, I mean, it is, after all, a law enforcement agency, right? Isn't that part of what's the problem with the structure?
Absolutely. I mean, to be clear, I think the conversation would be very different if the FBI came out and said, the only individuals who will be referred to SRCs are individuals for whom we have a prima facie case that they have committed a crime. And rather than putting them in prison and or prosecuting them, we are considering this intervention approach. I think it would look and feel a little different.
So, as part of a meeting recently, they basically said that, right? That if there's an FBI referral to an SRC, it's going to come through one where we believe there was a criminal predicate in place. But that addresses one part of it. The other part of it is that they have said the SRC can be put in place, and if there's a case that comes up organically, is the phrase they like to use, through the community, then that's different. What would be your answer to that? This idea that this is a vehicle to kind of try to address something that might be happening outside of the process.
And my response is that SRCs are just a sophisticated way of entrenching and expanding the use of confidential informants in the Muslim American community, right? If they are actually suggesting that communities are organically, that leaders are organically forming these committees, and they then send their youth to the FBI, it strikes me as far-fetched. It strikes me as far-fetched. And it seems to me that if CVE is to work, law enforcement has to stay outside of it. So if a group of community leaders want to gather at a community hall, in a mosque, in any type of center, and want to talk to their youth about ISIS, want to talk to their youth about violent extremism, they should be able to do that independent of law enforcement, without fear that law enforcement has penetrated that meeting through the use of a confidential informant, without fear that if they don't pass that information along that comes through in that meeting to the FBI, that there will somehow be consequences.
The idea of scale here, in terms of the problem that we have in place, there is no question that Europe, whose PREVENT program is partly what we've adopted here in the United States. Anyone advocating CVE policies on behalf of the government is upset when you compare it to Vermont, because they say we're not doing what they did there, we're doing it differently here, and that over there it was the government that's putting these programs in place. Here we're going to fund community-based organizations to do it. Do you think that's a significant difference?
Do you ask the question one more time?
The idea that government-sponsored programs to counter violent extremism is what they did in the UK model, and that what we're doing here is not that, because it is basically government-funded NGOs that are doing it. So it's a non-governmental organization. Therefore, there should be no problem with these programs.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's in many ways the same thing. What the FBI is trying to do is basically turn community leaders into an extension of law enforcement, when in fact community leaders do not have the training, do not have the toolkit to identify youth who are at risk of becoming violent extremists. Neither does the FBI, to be clear, but they also do not have the ability to distinguish between extremism, again, which is constitutionally protected, and violent extremism. So I think both models are failures. I also think that the reason that the United States government is looking to pass more of that burden onto community leaders is because it insulates them from a lot of the First Amendment concerns, right? So if community leaders are doing the policing, if community leaders are chilling the free religious expression, free speech, prioritizing one version of Islam over the other, there might not be a constitutional violation. But if the government was doing it, it might look very different.
Part of what I struggle with in understanding the way this is all played out is that there is a very real foreign fighter program and a problem in a post-ISIL environment taking place in Europe. We have not seen that here in the United States anywhere near the same scale. Yet we saw Congress appropriate $49 million last year and $50 million this year, specifically for CVE programming. Do you see an examination of these issues becoming part of the public discourse on this, or is it just now accepted that there is such a thing in CVE and everyone should fall in line with these programs?
I think it's the latter. I mean, we have had the government has refused to provide consensus, concrete numbers on how many Americans have wanted to join ISIS. Just today, I heard that FBI Director Comey said that right now, only one American a month wants to join ISIS. And yet we have pilot programs across the country. We have budget appropriation bills funding this work. We have community groups whose entire budgets are based on this programming. So as far as I'm concerned, again, back to where we started, one of the greatest problems with CVE is that it is incommensurate with the threat posed. You are many, many, many times more likely to die from gun violence than you are to die at the hands of a Muslim violent extremist, and no one wants to mention that.
Why do you think that hasn't pierced through the honest sort of intellectual conversation or debate on the effectiveness of these programs? This particular point, I mean, the scale point.
Yeah. I think in many ways it's because CVE is just the latest example of a law enforcement program that profiles and or myopically targets Muslim Americans. So for example, look at the U.S. watch listing program. The under the U.S. watch listing program, you can be branded a terrorist if you are a known terrorist or if there is reasonable suspicion to believe that you are a suspected terrorist, right? So the standard is extraordinarily elastic. And as a consequence, we know from leaked documents that Dearborn, Michigan, right, which I believe has a population of roughly
less than 100,000
less than 100,000 people, has more watch-listed residents than any other city in America except for New York. Why? Because Dearborn...
A population of millions.
Exactly, exactly. And it's because Dearborn, Michigan has a huge Muslim American, Arab American community. When you look at the NSA data collection programs, again, we know from leaked documents that although everybody was being watched by the NSA, some communities were being watched more than others. What communities, you ask? African American protesters who were part of the Black Lives Matter movement and Muslim Americans who tend to have strong political views. So we know the executive director for the Council for American Islamic Relations was being monitored. We know that a former Muslim American who was an advisor to George Bush, who ran for political office, was being monitored. So I think, and of course you have the NYPD mapping program, which didn't yield a single lead. So I think CVE is just the latest example of a series of over-inclusive programs that target Muslim Americans, but as time has passed, more and more Americans are willing to tolerate it because it's gone on for so long.
The issue, you mentioned Dearborn, Michigan, and you're right to point to that observation because it's one we've discussed frequently to highlight the startling discrepancies in how we look at the national security issues. Secretary Johnson was recently in Dearborn, actually, and it's become, as part of CVE programs, I would say it's become apparent that when we see Secretary Johnson or FBI Director Comey, or even in the president's remarks, that when there are conversations to be had with the American Muslim community, there is the thank you for being wonderful Americans, and then immediately sort of that following that is please help us in the war against terror as part of the CVE frame. How do you think that impacts the sort of the community resilience piece that they seem to talk so much about? We want you to resist all this, but for the first time ever, we're also viewing you as this other that needs to be viewed differently.
I mean, I would ask our leaders to help us, right? So President Obama visited a mosque for the first time in his administration a few months ago. I'm glad he did it, but he should have done it during his first term, right? Due to recent events in Paris, Brussels, San Bernardino, bigoted political rhetoric, Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, Sikh Americans have experienced an uptick in bullying, hate violence, employment discrimination, and they don't want to talk about that, right? They don't want to express solidarity with us. Instead, they think President Obama, for example, thinks a symbolic gesture like visiting a mosque once in 8 years is enough. So again, to be clear, I think that many Muslim Americans, live a life of second-class citizenship, where they rightfully fear being monitored, being scrutinized, and tasked with this burden of constantly monitoring their youth. Mm-hmm. And no other community bears that burden.
In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the first victims that fell to hate crimes were fellow Sikh Americans who were targeted wrongly for presumed to be Arab or Muslim. And it was remarkable at the time that the Sikh community never said, we're not Muslim. That simply did not take place. As you do the advocacy work that you all do so effectively on this issue, do you feel like it's working in the sense of government officials understanding the real problems of securitizing a community this way, of treating it in the way that it's happening?
I wish I could say that I have seen significant government progress in terms of dealing with what they perceive to be violent extremism, but I have not seen progress. I look at things like Don't Be a Puppet. I look at things like shared responsibility committees, the watch list program, the NSA data collection program, and I see these as examples of overreaching intelligence law enforcement programs that end up securitizing an entire community, right? The Constitution and criminal procedure are based on individual suspicion, namely the idea that you will monitor, surveil an individual if there is a connection to wrongdoing. We've replaced that with collective suspicion. And I think there are lots of groups, including my organization and yours, that are fighting against this. But I think we have a tall order in front of us.
I'm so grateful for the historical role that the community has played since 9/11 and continues to play now. The work that you all have done on pushback on particularly SRCs and the CVE program has been critical to enlighten this conversation. So thank you very much, Arjun, for joining us today and for that work. That is all the time that we have today. For more information, follow us on Twitter at AAIUSA or check out our website at aaiusa.org. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week on Viewpoint.